History of Mental Health by Juan Luis Cortez Cervantes. Lesson 6. The World After Freud. During the almost 40 years that Freud was the head of the psychoanalytic movement, between the separation of some of his disciples and the problems that the movement faced due to the nature of its statements, psychoanalysis gained international presence. It was September 1939, and days after Freud's death, the Second World War was declared to have begun. By this time, Freud had lost almost all the money he had earned from his work and publications to the Gestapo. His sisters would lose their lives in German concentration camps, and most of his disciples would flee to the United States, where social conditions favored the development of what was condemned in Europe as a Jewish science. It is noted that Freud himself disliked North American society and that he considered its population particularly racist, hypocritical and narcissistic due to the experiences he had when he was invited to teach at Clark University in Massachusetts in 1909. After Freud's death and under the command of Ernest Jones, the official biographer of Sigmund Freud, a first generation of psychoanalysts strongly influenced by North American culture began to make a career and determine the development of health policies through the analytical thinking initiated by Freud, a thought that was respected worldwide. Names, including Karen Horney, Erich Fromm, Hans Sachs and Heinz Hartmann, began a dissemination effort that became a second and third generation of North American psychoanalysts, increasingly separated from the thought of Sigmund Freud. Specifically, Heinz Hartmann would found a school of thought called the psychology of the ego, or ego psychology, relying on the latest lines of research by Sigmund Freud to begin a move away from the biological basis of psychoanalysis in human sexuality and introducing a process of hypothetical socialization that we can associate with American success, an extension of the so-called American dream. Although we cannot point to Hartmann as the creator of mental health, his relationship with psychoanalysis was the bridge that united the figure of Freud and the practice of psychoanalysis with American university psychology. Compare the values that shape Hartmann's text Psychoanalysis and the Concept of Health from 1939 and Psychoanalysis and Moral Values from 1960. Freudian psychoanalysis would be deformed in the United States by those disciples who sought their own economic future and their own place in history, taking steps towards the formation of cultural values that would later manifest themselves in mental health like a new morality with supposed scientific foundations. Now, mental health itself as a concept or medical ideal is a direct heir to the phrase or concept, mental hygiene, used for the first time by the American Dr. William Sweetser in 1843 in his book Mental Hygiene, or an examination of the intellect and the passions designed to illustrate their influence on health and length of life. We can already see in this first medical publication a step quite close to what would later become the culture of self-help, equating language with thought and associating health with success and happiness. And all this as an American cultural product within their medical cultural foundations. In this cultural context, the work of Heinz Hartmann would be inserted, and naturally a theory that promised an association between people or a social integration beyond the natural or inherent capabilities of the individual, had a tremendous success in the North American market. A culture inherited from strong identity conflicts, always non-conforming and violent in a direct or indirect way. A society that boasts strong moral values while attacking its fellow human beings and justifying its own violent actions for the own good of its victims. A breeding ground where civil society would take Hartmann's theory as the foundation of the self-help movement. Groups, among which Alcoholics Anonymous, which appeared in 1935 but would gain popularity a few years later, would take as cultural reference not Sigmund Freud, but doctors associated with Freud, such as Carl Gustav Jung, as they considered him more appropriate to their vision of spirituality without dogma or church. Carl Gustav Jung would be named within the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous as the Great Doctor, ignoring Jung's support for the German National Socialist Army during World War II. These self-help groups would begin to support a pseudo-religious approach to alcoholism, where there would no longer be a divine figure, and therefore they argued that they were saving those they called sick from a moral attack that came from religious circles. And through this assault on the construction of meaning, or within the semantic field, they would begin an invasion of the medical and religious fields. On the one hand, self-help groups would begin to flourish in the United States, ensuring that the moral attack of the church or religious groups was of no use to combat what they themselves called a disease. But in their work they would end up replacing the moral burden of religion with the moral burden of their own group, whose value would be compared to that God they did not dare to name. That is, according to them, alcoholism would cease to be a sin, defined as a voluntary act contrary to religious morals, and shift into a pseudo-clinical approach under the label of the incurable, progressive and fatal disease of alcoholism. All of this is made up not of scientific evidence, but of pseudo-religious discourse. This is one of the first cultural appropriation movements through which medicine is stripped of its cultural influence. In this fight to appropriate the medical terrain, self-help groups claimed to benefit those they labeled sick. They argued that characterizing alcoholics as maladjusted individuals was unfair, asserting instead that the disease was rooted in suffering. However, this development in the realm of value-laden concepts gradually blurred the boundaries of what was socially understood as illness and science. Little by little, professionals were adopting terms from self-help groups, like codependency. Originating within groups for the families of Alcoholics Anonymous members, the term codependency was used to explain the relationship between the alcoholic and some members of their families or social circle. And, of course, just as they labeled alcoholism a disease without any evidence, their relationships with other human beings were also labeled as sick. This linguistic approach served to establish a link between human relationships and the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program, incorporating human relationships into its scope, provided they were labeled sick. From an economic perspective, by fostering codependency, Alcoholics Anonymous had found a way to generate more clients for its supposed recovery process. Yet, at the same time, it had created the myth of healthy relationships, condemning any form of interpersonal conflict and stifling love itself beneath that promise of health. The worst part was that this offshoot of the Alcoholics Anonymous cultural movement gained a foothold among the professionals who would later champion mental health. By the 2000s, professional and academic circles of physicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists across almost every Western culture were openly discussing so-called codependency, a term used in a pseudo-clinical sense to describe one person's alleged addiction to another. Human relationships were no longer defined by mutual interest, whether born of affection, love, or any other bond. Instead, any personal difficulty within a social connection was flagged as evidence or a symptom of codependency. Love was expected to be free of pain, and any form of suffering was automatically condemned as a trauma that triggered mental illness. These professionals based this supposed clinical approach on a perspective derived from human relationships they could neither form nor sustain, unwittingly attacking the will and connections of others under the pretext that they were allegedly sick. Consequently, even within scientific and academic bodies at the turn of the century, attachment to anyone was suddenly prohibited under the threat of being labeled codependent. But affection was not the only target of social prohibition. Soon, various movements emerged to point out supposedly unhealthy habits, inventing addictions to sex, cell phones, masturbation, food, and even car usage. Ultimately, everything within scientific circles was deemed unhealthy and therefore curable, although no one knew exactly how to treat these conditions without relapses, or if a definitive cure was even possible. At this point, one must emphasize the role of Alcoholics Anonymous in freely appropriating the medical term illness to introduce it into the realm of a new social morality, while simultaneously stripping it of its actual clinical and medical function. That is to say, starting with Alcoholics Anonymous, doctors had a much deeper decrease in their power of social influence than with psychoanalysis. While this scenario was developing in the United States under the indirect influence of North American psychoanalysis, in South America, particularly in Argentina, another aspect of Sigmund Freud's thought was developing, strongly influenced by what was called a social consciousness that was missing in Freud, according to these theorists. Being thus the main representatives of Freudian thought in Argentina, they were also associated with the Communist Party. Freudo-Marxism was born. Figures such as Marie Langer, Enrique Pichon Rivera, and José Bleger laid the foundations for a militant theoretical development that would lead psychoanalysis to be associated first with Marxism-Leninism and then with feminism. This association between psychoanalysis and feminism would come as a consequence of the decline of Marxist thought in South American university education in the 2000s. Before moving forward, the author of the course would like to point out that Freud was not a Marxist and that psychoanalysis, just as it was not designed to create a path or method or therapy to achieve mental health, nor did it seek social justice. The author of this course attributes the relationship that other authors established between Freud and Marx, precisely to the social conditions that saw the birth of Freud's work. the Argentine authors saw their lives threatened by the authoritarian regimes that occurred in their lifetime. Although Freud did not have that social pressure, his perspective of life allowed him another type of political and social stance. This position was negated by the Freudo-Marxists, who limited themselves to pointing out a vacuum of social consciousness in Freud's work, a gap that they set out to correct. However, this supposed emptiness or vacuum in Freud's work is precisely what allows psychoanalysis, and that supposed emptiness is human freedom. A freedom impossible to conceive as an exercise of power, which translates in the medical relationship into the promise, I am going to give you mental health. Let us remember that psychoanalysis is much less paternalistic, pointing out the patient as a subject with full use of his will, perhaps unconscious. While all this was happening on the new continent, the eye of the psychoanalytic hurricane moved from Vienna to England, where Melanie Klein would oppose the traditionalism that Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, supported and represented. Shortly after this political and ideological battle broke out in the country that saw Sigmund Freud die, the last representative figure of international psychoanalysis would appear in France, the French psychiatrist Jacques-Marie Lacan. And all this in a world already hit by the Second World War, before the United Nations was the direct successor of the League of Nations. In less than 6 years after the death of Sigmund Freud, advances in physics would be developed that would allow the construction of the weapon that would change international politics. We are talking about the atomic or nuclear bomb. In August 1945, the United States Army would drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to see the end of the war in September of that same year. The entire world, including psychoanalysts, would doubt the future of humanity. At that time, psychology as a discipline did not have the burden it had later, and psychiatry would submit to the arms interests of the governments participating in the Second World War. There was no hint of a public policy that took mental health as an object of interest. But that would not last long. Although the Charter of the United Nations would be signed on June 26, 1945, the development and use of nuclear weapons would call into question the meaning of said charter. In such a way that towards the end of October 1945 it is recognized as the birth or creation of the United Nations through an international ratification protocol. That is to say, although the signing was before the explosion of the atomic bomb, its occurrence would mark a milestone in international politics. The fear of annihilation would begin to pulse among the world's population. And so, why sign a document that would not stop a bomb with the capacity to erase all life on the planet? The impact of said weapons development was so profound that the first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, which occurred in January 1946, was specifically dedicated to creating a commission to address the problems derived from the discovery of atomic energy and request the elimination of weapons of mass destruction. A few months later, on July 22, 1946, the World Health Organization would be formed as the United Nations arm, dedicated to defining and promoting government mechanisms to protect health as a universal human right. And it is in this context that the imprecise notion or idea of mental health appears for the first time, not as a reality or as a scientific concept, but as a health policy promoted by international organizations. In the World Health Organization Constitution, signed by 61 states of the world on July 22, 1946, health is defined for the first time not only as the absence of disease, but as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, opening a range of undefined possibilities about what falls into the category of disease. In 1948, the World Federation for Mental Health was founded in London. This body was crucial in introducing the term mental health to the agenda of the newly created United Nations Organization and the World Health Organization. Some of the creators of the World Federation for Mental Health included representatives of the psychoanalytic movement such as John Rawlings Rees, George Brock Chisholm, Harry Stack Sullivan, and Margaret Mead. Shortly after, the first committee of experts in mental hygiene would be formed in the World Health Organization. The first recommendations are established to integrate mental health prevention into general public health services. Among the experts on said committee would include the names Ronald Hargreaves and Brock Chisholm, both with a history within the psychoanalytic community of their time. Here we see how a psychoanalysis increasingly far from the Freudian proposal becomes part of an intercultural public policy. Far removed were the recommendations written by Freud to Albert Einstein in the text Why War? Violence took on the character of a psychic defect, the prelude to mental health and therefore the consolidation of a new and alleged scientific morality was already cemented. But the year 1953 would arrive, the date for which the World Health Assembly formally introduced mental health as a category that surpasses hospital psychiatry, promoting treatment in the community for the first time. Although the World Health Assembly does not define social actors or treatment mechanisms, it simply establishes a scenario and actors without defined characteristics and functions. A first glimpse of a failed public health policy. In that same year in France, psychiatrist Jacques Lacan began his formal teaching at Saint Anne Hospital. In direct and simple terms, Lacan's teaching seeks a return to Freud among psychoanalysts, an increasingly divided group that would end up turning its back on him. In such a way that Lacan would end up forming his own school and its corresponding clinical practice, far from the policy imposed by the United Nations on countries through the World Health Organization. Mental health had been born as a result of war, the fear of nuclear extinction and in the prelude to the Cold War. And at the same time, the World Health Organization presents its policy as an effort to influence a human being who was scary because of what he could do, say, or think. Unknowingly, mental health would simultaneously become a source of conflict between states and their citizens, as well as a desperate search for the peace of mind that science itself had stolen, perhaps permanently.